26th of December, and you're tuned into our afternoon edition of Arirang News, coming to you from Seoul. I'm Kwon Jang-ho, and it's good to have you with us. It's a new milestone in inter-Korean relations. The two Koreas held a groundbreaking ceremony that symbolizes the start of the ambitious project to reconnect each other's rail and road networks. Let's go straight to Devin Whiting at their news center, who has more on that story, along with our other headlines of the day. Over to you, Devin.
Thanks, Jung-ho. It was 8 months ago that South and North Korea first agreed to work together on this transport project. Work has been held back by a lack of progress in talks between the North and the U.S., but today they finally broke ground on the project, at least symbolically. With more, our Unification Ministry correspondent Oh Jung-hee joins us on the line. Jung-hee, what's the latest?
Devin, South and North Korea held the groundbreaking ceremony at North Korea's Panmun Station this morning. It ended in the morning, and the South Koreans who attended returned back home this afternoon. There were 100 participants from each side. From the South, it was Seoul's Transport and Unification Ministers Kim Hyun-mi and Jo Myung-gyun, along with the leaders of South Korea's political parties and officials related to railways and roads. From North Korea, it was Ri Son-kwon, the head of Pyeongyang's Reunification Committee, along with senior officials from North Korea's Economic Cooperation Committee and its vice ministers of railways and land. Also at the ceremony were top railway and road officials from Russia, China, and Mongolia, and the executive secretary of the UN's Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. They all agreed on the vision of connecting a transport network across the Eurasian continent. South Korea's transport minister stressed that this project will bring economic benefits to both Koreas by reducing the time and cost for the logistics here, which is currently done mainly by shipping. North Korea's railway minister highlighted that this inter-Korean project will not only create prosperity for Seoul and Pyeongyang, but the whole world. But even though South and North Korea held the groundbreaking ceremony today, they won't be starting construction right away. The two Koreas will have to get sanctions waivers from the UN Security Council for whatever work they do in the future. And Seoul also plans to do more detailed surveys before coming up with construction plans. South Korea says the actual construction work won't begin yet, and things will go in accordance with progress on North Korea's denuclearization and following waivers on sanctions. Back to you, Devin.
All right, and we'll be keeping our eyes on that for sure. Thanks for that update, Jung-hee. And it would appear that progress between North Korea and the U.S. is slowed down in terms of denuclearization. But South Korea's Foreign Minister Kang says nuclear talks between the two are still ongoing. And she says they're discussing dates for their next high-level talks. Our Kang Hyung-woo has more.
South Korean Foreign Minister Kang says that North Korea and the U.S. remain fully committed to dialogue and that the two sides are continuing their denuclearization talks. In an interview with local news outlet Hankyoreh, Kang said Pyongyang and Washington are discussing possible dates for their next high-level talks. She emphasized the need for the meeting to include guarantees for the two sides and define what those guarantees should be. One crucial issue is what guarantees the U.S. will offer when North Korea shuts down its Yongbyon nuclear complex, which would be a big concession from the regime. The two countries also feel the need for a second summit between North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and U.S. President Donald Trump. But according to Kang, there's great uncertainty on whether it will take place in January or February next year as hoped. And last week, the U.S. Special Representative to North Korea, Stephen Biegun, made some conciliatory gestures to the North during his visit to Seoul. He said the U.S. will review allowing its citizens to visit the North for humanitarian purposes and consider sending humanitarian aid worth $8 million to the country. Kang said it will be a big step forward if the regime responds to those gestures, which is why attention now turns to Kim Jong-un's New Year's address. As for the sanctions on the North, Kang said Seoul and Washington will need to coordinate closely on the appropriate time to lift the sanctions. Of course, it will depend on how much progress is made on the irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. There will also need to be similar discussions at the UN Security Council. Kang Hyung-woo, Arirang News.
The South Korean government is looking at new economic policies for the new year as it tries to boost growth. Manufacturing has long been the engine for South Korea's growth, and what manufacturing needs now is innovation. That's what President Moon said today in a meeting of his economic advisors. Our Blue House correspondent Hwang Ho-jun reports.
According to the South Korean president, the nation's economy desperately needs a jumpstart, and the key to it is industrial innovation.
우리의 전통 주력 제조 산업을 혁신해서 고도화하고 그걸 통해서 또 경쟁력을 높여 나가는 것도 대단히 절실하고 또 앞으로 우리 미래의 성장 동력을 마련하기 위해서 우리 경제를 혁신해 나가는 것도 또 대단히 절실한 그런 과제입니다.
President Moon Jae-in was speaking Wednesday afternoon in a general meeting of the National Economic Advisory Council. According to the Blue House, the objective of the meeting was for the president, along with his economic advisors and ministers, to first evaluate the government's big economic push this year, such as the income-led growth policy and the sharp rise in the minimum wage, and then to discuss and take a closer look at the economic policy direction for the new year.
오늘 우리 대한민국 경제 지금 요즘 침체, 부진 뭐 이런 이야기를 많이 듣고 심지어는 좀 미래가 잘 보이지 않는다 이런 이제 우려들도 있는데 오늘 대한민국 경제가 다시 활기를 되찾고 미래를 향해서 열심히 달려갈 수 있는 그런 이제 좋은 논의들이 이루어지기를 바랍니다.
President Moon's economic advisor, Kim Hyun visited the Blue House Press Center to give a briefing about the meeting. Kim said the council called for mid to long-term strategies to bring about industrial innovation that can overcome the current difficulties and secure future growth engines. Several tasks for the government were proposed during the meeting: investing in people, establishing future-oriented relations between labor and management, narrowing the focus of core technologies, actively pursuing regulatory reform, and cultivating an environment friendly for entrepreneurship. The council also suggested creating an active communication channel between the government and industries, academia, and labor. It was just last week when receiving a policy briefing from the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy, President Moon asserted the significance of a complete transformation of the manufacturing industry to help South Korea keep its global leadership in the area. Hwang Ho-jun, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the Minister of Strategy and Finance, Hong Nam-gi, says the government will extend the grace period it announced for companies to implement the new, shorter 52-hour work week. The policy was going to take effect at the start of the new year. In a meeting on Wednesday, the finance minister said the transition period will continue until the National Assembly reaches a consensus on part of its implementation, namely a flexible work system under which work hours are calculated over a 3-month period to give companies some room to maneuver. Initially, starting in January, if a company with 300 or more workers were to violate the weekly cap, its head could face up to 2 years in jail or a fine of more than $17,000. In the new year, South Korea's central bank is going to keep its inflation target at 2%, where it's been since 2016. The Bank of Korea's inflation target is set based on changes in the Consumer Price Index. Officials say 2% is not only considered the optimal rate of inflation for the South Korean economy, but is also on par with many of the world's other major central banks like the U.S. Federal Reserve. The BOK also pointed out that it did not specify an exact timeline this time because inflation has been steady over the last 10 years. South Korea's Consumer Price Index rose 2% in November, on par with the central bank's target for the second month in a row. I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines.
Now, in this section of today's program, we'll be discussing further about the implications of the groundbreaking ceremony for the InterKorean Rail and Road Reconnection project that took place earlier today. Now, to recap from earlier, the ceremony took place at Panmun Station, just north of the border, and was attended by some 200 officials from the two sides, including Seoul's Transport Minister and Unification Minister, and on the north side, the senior official in charge of InterKorean affairs and their Vice Railway Minister. There were also officials from the United Nations and other countries, including China, Russia, and Mongolia. The ceremony took place after it was confirmed yesterday that the UN Security Council had granted a special waiver on sanctions for the event. The project to reconnect the rail and road networks was announced when the two leaders of the two Koreas met for their summits earlier this year. But despite today's ceremony, actual construction on the project will not begin because of the economic sanctions on the regime, which the US has promised will stay in place until Pyongyang gets rid of its nuclear weapons. Now, to take a further look at the significance of these developments, joining us now, we have Dr. Hyun from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. It's good to have you back on the show today.
Thank you.
The groundbreaking ceremony for the rail and road reconnection project went off today without too much of a hitch. It looked like it was a very good-natured affair from what we could see from the pictures. What do you make of these events today?
Well, it's actually an important ceremony, no doubt about it, but at the same time, it's actually a little bit underwhelming, given the fact that if everything was going according to plan in terms of inter-Korean dialogue, actually last week would have been marked by the visit by Kim Jong-un to Seoul for the first time after the end of the Korean War. But then instead of a visit by the North Korean leader, we are actually having a small event marking the quote-unquote beginning of the railway reconnection ceremony, which would have been just one of the many events that could have taken place between the two Koreas. So this is actually indicates that the inter-Korean project that was being planned by both Koreas is actually being delayed by the fact that there's no commensurate progress taking place on the denuclearization negotiation front.
Sure, it's being called a groundbreaking ceremony, but actually no ground can be actually broken because the construction cannot start because of without sanctions being lifted. Why then have the two Koreas decided to go ahead with the ceremony today?
Well, it is important, at least for South Korea, to maintain the perception that the inter-Korean dialogue is progressing. This actually has an important political meaning for the South Korean domestic audience. So in order to keep up the momentum of the dialogue, even though today's ceremony doesn't really mark the beginning of an actual material economic engagement project, it actually shows to the domestic public that North Korea and South Korea are maintaining the posture of dialogue for the time being.
But then Seoul has stressed that this project could bring economic potential for both Koreas. But as we said, surely that's a long way off, especially as nothing can go ahead without North Korea first denuclearizing. And so far, they haven't really shown significant steps they're going to take towards that. But then how real is this potential economic benefit, and how far away is it?
Well, in terms of potential, this is a huge potential, no doubt about it. If we connect if we are able to connect South Korea and Europe through Central Asia via railway, it's going to have an important transport benefits in terms of savings in transportation cost, also in terms of stimulating the regional economic cooperation and engagement in the region. We have to understand that much of the economic potential in northern China and eastern Russia is actually blocked by the fact that the Korean Peninsula is divided into two. But then at the same time, we have to think about the potential cost of, and also the time period, time frame in which this potential will pay off. It's going to be a long way off because we have to, the transportation is just one of the many links that could, bring out the potential in this region. We have to have actually progress being made on multiple different fronts, such as, reconnecting not just the transportation, but opening the market, also protecting the investment that could take place in North Korea, as well as, developing different sorts of economic demand and markets in North Korea and in each environments. So, the transportation network is more symbolic than actual for that reason. Even if it happens, for the real economic payoff to be realized, it might take multiple years, even decades.
Multiple years or even possibly decades. But what's interesting was that these other countries as well, not just on the Korean Peninsula, that also have a long-term invested thinking on this, because officials from Russia, China, and Mongolia all came to this symbolic groundbreaking ceremony that took place, because eventually they will have a direct link through China and all the way to Europe, and there is economic potential for them as well, right?
Well, that's correct. And also we have to understand that the the railway connection between the two Koreas is just the beginning of integrating South Korea's transportation network with the rest of the Eurasian continent. The reason why the countries from such as Mongolia and Russia and other countries sent their representatives to these ceremonies because they are actually the members of the organization called Organization for the Cooperation of Railways. This is actually the remnants of the Cold War. It was was set up by the Soviet Union back then. So most of the current members of this organization are former members of the Eastern Bloc as well as the Central Asian states. And these countries have obviously a built-in interest in expanding the railway network. So they probably see eye to eye with North Korea and South Korea that connecting their railway network, which is primarily based in Eurasia, to East Asian countries and economic powerhouse such as South Korea would bring economic benefits to them too.
Well, we'll have to see. Obviously, if this project does come to fruition, you'll be able to get a train from Busan all the way through North Korea, through Russia, and possibly even through to Europe and possibly London as well, my hometown.
Oh, well,
we'll have to see if that happens. But let me go back to the UN Security Council sanctions as well. So for this groundbreaking ceremony to take place today, the UN had to give a special sanctions waiver for it to happen because obviously holding this ceremony would have taken certain costs and equipment that was needed for everything to take place. So does this actually then open the door perhaps to more sanctions and more other special waivers being given? In other words, do you think there's any hope that the two Koreas can move ahead with the rail and road reconnection projects beyond this groundbreaking ceremony? Is there any wiggle room, do you think?
Well, I think the fact that it took so long for the groundbreaking ceremony to take place because of sanctions actually shows that how difficult it is to relax even some measures of sanctions against North Korea at the present moment. The fact is that the United Nations actually gave a very specific waiver specifically for this ceremony. I think the United Nations made sure that both Koreas didn't misunderstand that this waiver wouldn't extend to further relaxation of the sanctions. If you look at the sanctions waiver application, I think it was very clear that all the materials that was allowed to go into North Korea for this ceremony was actually specifically for this single event, not to help any permanent construction or increased economic assistance in North Korea temporarily even. So I think the United Nations made very clear that this is a one-time waiver. So I think there's no much wiggle room when it comes to relaxing sanctions based on this one single ceremony.
So where do they go from here then? What happens to this project now?
Well, the project is going to be in indefinite hold as long as the sanctions are in place. So I think everybody will be looking towards the potential breakthrough in the denuclearization talks between Washington and Pyongyang for any type of economic engagement to resume in the near future.
Well, moving on to that potential breakthrough in US-North Korea negotiations, President Trump tweeted on Christmas Eve a picture of himself getting briefed by the Special Representative of North Korea, Stephen Biegun. And Trump said in that tweet, progress is being made and that he's looking forward to the next summit with Kim Jong-un. So it seems like, at least in Trump's mind, a second summit with him and Kim Jong-un will happen sometime soon.
Well, let's all hope so. But then, I think President Trump has made similar remarks several times before, and then that didn't lead to the second summit between Kim and Kim Jong-un. So what he said last time doesn't really show that the second summit is imminent. So I think what he's referring to is that I think he probably found through Steve Biegun that North Korea is still, in principle, committed to having the second summit with President Trump, but at the same time, it's not so clear what they're going to discuss at the second summit. We know for sure that North Korea hasn't been very clear about what kind of denuclearization steps it will take for the second summit to be realized. So maybe if the United States lowers its expectation about the second summit, so instead of discussing about the concrete terms of denuclearization, they just like meet. I mean, the two leaders of United States and North Korea just meet for the meeting's sake. Then the second summit might be possible. But then we're not sure whether the level of discussion that's being taking place between Pyongyang and Washington has gone into that level where either side will have to adjust their expectation about the summit.
Do you think Pyongyang are stalling rather than trying to find some sort of terms of negotiation that they might find suitable for them? Is this just a tactic to delay things?
Well, I think they are not delaying for delay's sake. I think they are using delay as a way to pressure the United States to essentially to become impatient, because the U.S. actually works in a very concrete, deterministic time frame. They need to provide concrete results to important stakeholders back in the U.S. Political system, such as the U.S. Congress. So I think U.S. administration, even though there's no concrete pressure, they are working under the clock. They need to provide a result for them to show to the American public, and I think North Korea is conscious of that. So I think North Korea is actually using the delay in order to elicit better terms of a negotiation from the United States.
There's been no direct response from North Korea about these current negotiations with the US, but we might be getting some sort of information next week when Kim Jong-un delivers his New Year's Day speech. I mean, do you think that will be possible?
Well, that's the expectation that we have. Actually, that's my personal expectation too. But then we have to remember that the bulk of the New Year address actually is devoted to the internal issues in North Korea rather than the external objectives or external messaging. So there's some chance that North Korea might not even mention about denuclearization much. But then what really matters is the timing of the whatever statement that comes out of Pyongyang. So it might not be the New Year's address where we can actually look into North Korean thinking into denuclearization. Might be some other statement that's issued sometimes afterwards. So, but then timing-wise, I would expect North Korea to say something at the beginning of the year to qualify their posture towards denuclearization.
I think you're trying to lower our expectations of what could be coming out from that speech.
That's correct.
So we'll have to see what does actually come out. Before we go, let's move on to a couple of other things as well. So in a rather curious development, North Korea last week sent a Christmas video message to a South Korean church group. Now, it shows a mass and a service that takes place in a Korean cathedral and a Korean church, and it shows Christmas trees as well, very festive for this time of year. It also talks about the InterKorean agreements reached this year and how it's a common mission and responsibility for religious followers in both Koreas to achieve. Now, this is quite bizarre. It's the first time I understand they've done something like this before, and because we know there is no freedom of religion in North Korea, and that even these church masses that we've seen and they have is actually for show, just for foreign visitors. I mean, what do you think was the thinking behind this message then?
Well, clearly this is a propaganda piece. There's no doubt about it. But at the same time, you have to read a little bit between the lines here. Why is North Korea making the effort to send such a bizarre message to South Korea? I mean, the fact is that I think North Korea, by doing this, they're actually showing that they care about maintaining the pretense of the dialogue between the civil society groups. I mean, we know that in North Korea, there's no such a thing as civil society. But at the same time, the fact is that the regime is paying attention to it. It shows that the North Korea wants to maintain some resemblance of a dialogue to go on for next year. I think that's actually a very good sign, in my view. That shows that no matter what happens on the denuclearization front, even if it breaks down, it shows that the North Korea might be invested in the inter-Korean dialogue to a significant extent, that they might put the energy to maintain it for the foreseeable future. So in that sense, this could be a positive sign.
It shows they're making effort, but it's just a very bizarre move to make because it's so ham-fisted. Because
of course,
recently, I mean, the US has been talking about human rights abuses that North Korea has been making, and to be honest, this highlights the human rights, the issues that they have, because we all know there is no freedom of religion.
No, I totally agree. I think North Korea is doing this to send a message that there's a freedom of religion there. I mean, they might actually believe that they do have a freedom of religion, but we know that the rest of the world doesn't believe in it. So I think that's the reason why we should read between the lines here, that the fact that North Korea is trying to make the effort to maintain some sort of a connection with the South Korean civil society. I mean, I think that's a good sign, as indicative of the fact that North Korea is invested in the inter-Korean dialogue to an extent that we actually imagine that actually a little bit beyond our what was expected.
I think we've got time for one more Trump tweet before we go. In a tweet on Christmas Eve as well, he mentioned that very rich countries were taking advantage of the US to substantially subsidize their militaries. And this seems to be talking about pressure, especially not directly, but it implies South Korea's hosting of the US forces and the costs that they share. And that Trump wants to, wants South Korea to pay more. He said this before, and this tweet again implies this. Now, this is perhaps not a good sign for South Korea, especially as there are also reports that negotiations are back to square one. I mean, what do you make of the situation?
Well, this is clearly I mean, I don't think President Trump is implying that the South Korea should pay more. I think he's telling South Korea to pay more. There's no doubt about it. But then what he's saying is actually grounded on facts. I mean, the 70% of the U.S. government spends on basing their troops outside the United States are spent on three countries: Germany, Japan, and South Korea. And by all means, these three countries are very important economic powerhouses. And on the surface, it makes sense that three countries should actually bear more of the defense burden, defense of their own country. But then at the same time, what President Trump is ignoring is that overall, even though percentage-wise it sounds like it's actually big, in terms of absolute terms, it's actually very small. I mean, $1 billion, that's actually the cost that South Korea is paying right now for defense burden sharing. Might sound a lot, but given if you look at the overall U.S. defense budget, it's actually very small. It's actually a little bit represents actually a change. And some decimal numbers actually. So in that sense, I think what President Trump is ignoring by saying all this is that he's totally ignoring the fact that the alliance with these countries like South Korea, Japan, and Germany doesn't only help these three countries mentioned, but also help the United States to a great deal and saves a lot of money for the United States. So I think that's something that he's actually ignoring this point. And then it's important for the allies to remind the U.S. government and President Trump especially that being allies to the United States actually is helpful for the United States and for the security of the United States especially.
Well, we'll have to wrap things up. Thank you for coming in today, and we hope to see you again in the new year.
Definitely. Thanks.
And that is where we'll conclude our show for today. I'll be back same time tomorrow, but do tune into our other regular newscasts for the latest updates from Korea and around the world. Thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.